Phil Kessel might be the single best athlete in the NHL. In a league full of genetic freaks, it's Kessel who's managed to grab one of the NHL's most impressive records while being among the league's best throughout much of his Ironman run. As his career begins to wind down in his later years, Kessel is reportedly willing to bring an end to his streak, if it helps him find a place as a regular in a team's lineup. Ahead of the season in which his incredible Ironman record likely comes to an end, let's take a look at the incredible career of Phil Kessel. Kessel came into the NHL through the U.S. National Development Program and NCAA, a route that was much less common when he was drafted in 2006. He played exceptionally well for the University of Minnesota in his draft year, enough so that he earned the privilege of being selected 5th overall to the Boston Bruins. In his first NHL season, Kessel already overcame extreme adversity. Midway through the season, Kessel found out he had testicular cancer. Incredibly, less than 1 month later, he was back on the ice for Boston, having defeated the cancer. Kessel's incredible feat earned him the Bill Masterton Trophy in what was a pretty solid year on the ice as well. It would take another full season beforehand, but a 21-year-old Kessel broke out to star status in his third year for the Boston Bruins, leading the team with 36 goals. Phil Kessel was one of Boston's best players, but the right wing was one of their positions of strength. In addition to Kessel, they had Michael Ryder, Blake Wheeler, and Chuck Kobasu, all of whom were among the team's top scorers. When the Toronto Maple Leafs came in with a big offer for Kessel, it was too good to refuse. For the price of 2 unprotected first-round picks and a second-rounder, Phil Kessel was now a Toronto Maple Leaf. Kessel was joining a Leafs team that had missed the playoffs by 12 points. They were too good to get a top draft pick, but still too bad to be really in the playoff hunt. Kessel was expected to immediately be the team's brightest young star and future, especially now that their next 2 first-round picks were gone. The good news is, Kessel was the team's best player. He scored 30 goals and kicked off the first 70 games of his Ironman streak. The bad news, the Leafs were awful, worse than the year before, even with Kessel. Their draft pick became the 2nd overall pick, which now belonged to Boston. They used that pick to select Tyler Seguin. With that selection, the next saga of Kessel's career began. The Leafs were bad and missed out on their chance to grab one of the league's most promising young centers. For whatever reason, Toronto's media seemed to place the blame for that on Kessel and not Leafs management. While this type of talk would rage for years to come, Kessel seemed largely unfazed, which then played into the narrative that he just didn't care about the team. The next season, Dion Phaneuf was named captain, and there was another player to shift the blame onto. The Leafs were mediocre yet again. Kessel was their top scorer again. The Bruins had their first pick, and they used it to select Dougie Hamilton, who also became a fantastic player. With that, Toronto's ties to the Kessel trade were complete. After another middling year, we reached the infamous season in which the Toronto Maple Leafs got as far as they ever would with Phil Kessel. 2012-13 was a lockout-shortened season, and the teams played only 48 games. Kessel placed 7th in league scoring, and was the driving factor in the Leafs returning to the playoffs for their first season since 2004. The 5th-place Leafs matched against the 4th-place Bruins, and we all remember how that went. In the seasons afterwards, the Leafs regressed. Coaches and GMs were fired, and sentiments against the core of the team grew. Kessel and the Leafs were barreling towards the end of their time together as the team looked to move on to a new, young star core. On July 1st, 2015, Phil Kessel was traded for the second time in his career. He left what was maybe the most dysfunctional franchise in the NHL at the time and joined the immediate Cup favorite Pittsburgh Penguins. Playing for a top contender in a much smaller hockey market meant a completely redefined role for Phil. He was still counted on to be a star player, but nowhere near the star on a team with Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, and Chris Letang, among others. Kessel concluded his first season in Pittsburgh with 59 points, a great total, but his lowest points per game average since his second season in the NHL. Even though he wasn't expected to be the guy anymore, he became that again in the playoffs. In a run that could have won him the Conn Smythe Trophy, Phil Kessel scored the most points of anyone on the Pittsburgh Penguins, as they claimed their franchise's fourth Stanley Cup, and Kessel got his first. After the adversity he'd faced in the earlier years of his career, it was a triumphant and deserved moment for Kessel to not only win when so many said he couldn't, but to also do it as the winning team's top scorer. And of course, the next year, he and the Penguins would do it again. The Pittsburgh Penguins became the first team in the Cap era to win back-to-back Stanley Cups. Again, Phil Kessel was at the forefront of their success. The Pittsburgh era proved definitively that Phil Kessel was a playoff performer and a winner. Kessel got the last laugh in the end, proving all those who had doubted him wrong. In 2019, Kessel was part of a package sent to the Coyotes for Alex Galchenyuk and Pierre-Olivier Joseph. Arizona was back to the same sort of mediocrity that had been there in Toronto, and though they made the playoffs in Kessel's first year, it was only downhill from there. Overall, Phil put up good numbers, but was clearly losing some of the pace in his game as his contract wound down. After his 8-year deal initially signed in Toronto had fully expired, Kessel signed a 1-year deal with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now fully sequestered to a bottom 6 role, Kessel still managed 36 points with the Golden Knights. 13 years after the Ironman streak had begun, he managed to still play in every single regular season game with Vegas. That wasn't the same in the playoffs. Of Vegas's 22 playoff games leading to the Stanley Cup, Phil Kessel played in 4. When it really came down to it, Kessel wasn't one of their best 12 forwards. But with 86 games for the Golden Knights throughout the course of 2022-23, he'd done more than enough to earn his name on the Cup for the third time. Phil Kessel exited the 2022-23 season a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, and the record holder for the longest Ironman streak in NHL history, holding a total of 1,064 consecutive regular season appearances. He is the only player to ever play over 1,000 consecutive games, a feat that second place Keith Yandle came up just shy of when his streak was snapped at 989 a year ago. But Kessel also exited the past season without a contract extension from Vegas, and he remains unsigned today. If this is the year his crowning achievement comes to an end, Phil Kessel has still done way more than enough for a Hall of Fame level career. He beat cancer in his first season, and established himself as a young star in Boston. He was the face of the Leafs for years, and despite everything that came with that, he got them back to the playoffs for the first time in 9 years. He became a superstar in Pittsburgh, won 2 Stanley Cups, and even outscored Crosby and Malkin in his prime. And at the end of it all, Phil Kessel can boast that he's won 3 Stanley Cups, played over 1,300 games, scored over 1,000 points, and held maybe the single most impressive athletic achievement among the best athletes in the world.